The ballroom that night was a cathedral of light and power, where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars, and marble floors reflected the faces of men and women who had never known hunger, never tasted rejection, never questioned whether they belonged. The air shimmered with expensive perfume and whispered promises, with champagne bubbles rising in glasses held by hands, adorned with rings that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. In the center of this glittering world stood a young woman whose cream-colored gown hung in tatters from her shoulder. The delicate fabric she had sewn by candlelight, now torn and exposing the simple slip beneath. Her name was Amara, and in that moment, with 100 pairs of eyes turning toward her, like wolves catching the scent of weakness, she stood frozen on the grand staircase, while her stepmother smiled down at her with the kind of cruelty that only family can perfect. The woman's voice rang out sweetly, dripping with false concern, telling anyone within earshot that the dress had simply fallen apart because some things were never meant to be. And laughter rippled through the crowd, like poison spreading through water. But Amara did not cry, did not run, did not collapse beneath the weight of humiliation, because years of living under that woman's roof had taught her that tears were a language cruel people loved to speak, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. Then something shifted in the room, subtle at first, like the moment before thunder breaks across a silent sky. A voice cut through the noise, deep and commanding, wrapped in silk, but heavy as stone, and it spoke a single word that made every conversation stop, every champagne glass pause, halfway to painted lips, every calculated smile freeze in place. The word was enough, and it came from a man moving through the crowd, with the kind of presence that made even the wealthiest guests step aside, without thinking, their bodies responding to power before their minds could catch up. He was tall and elegant, his suit fitting him like it had been crafted by artisans who understood that true luxury whispered rather than shouted, and his skin gleamed under the chandelier light with the richness of polished mahogany. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but they locked onto Amara with an intensity that made her forget, for just a moment, that her dress was torn and her humiliation was public. This was Kene Adebayo, the billionaire whose name was spoken with reverence in boardrooms across the continent, the man whose wealth had built schools and hospitals, whose influence reached presidents and kings, whose face appeared on magazine covers with headlines that called him untouchable. He stopped directly in front of Amara, and without a word, without asking permission, he removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering her exposed skin with fabric that probably cost more than everything she owned. The room fell into a silence so complete that Amara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like distant drums. She looked up at Kene, this man she had never met, this stranger who had just stepped between her and her shame like a shield made of certainty and wealth. And she saw something in his eyes that made no sense, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had been searching for her across years and distance and had finally, impossibly, found what he was looking for. He turned slowly toward Mrs. Okonkwo, Amara's stepmother, who stood on the staircase with her mask of confidence beginning to crack like dried clay. And when he spoke again, his voice was low, but carried the weight of mountains. He told her that if she ever touched Amara again, she would learn what it meant to lose everything. And the threat hung in the air, not as anger, but as simple fact. The way a king might mention that the sun rises in the east. Mrs. Okonkwo's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, searching for words that would not come, while her daughter, Chidera, stood beside her in a designer gown that suddenly seemed garish and desperate under the chandelier's unforgiving light. Then Kene looked back at Amara, and for the first time that night, his expression softened into something that might have been tenderness, might have been hope, might have been the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. But to understand how Amara came to stand in that ballroom, wrapped in a billionaire's jacket, while her world tilted on its axis, we must go back to the beginning, back to the place where her story started, in the red soil and golden sunlight of the African countryside. She was born in a village called Umunna, where life moved to the rhythm of seasons and harvests, where children ran barefoot through fields of cassava and corn, where elders sat beneath the spreading branches of ancient mango trees and told stories that had been passed down through generations like precious jewels. Her father had been a farmer, a man whose hands were calloused from honest work, whose back was bent from years of coaxing life from the earth, whose smile could light up a room, despite the fact that he had never owned anything more valuable than his dignity and his word. Her mother had been the kind of woman who sang while she cooked, who could make a feast from scraps, who believed that love was something you gave freely rather than something you held back until conditions were met. They were not wealthy by any measure the world recognized, had no bank accounts or property deeds or investments, but they were rich in the ways that mattered, in laughter shared over simple meals, in the security of knowing they belonged to each other, and to the community that surrounded them like protective arms. Amara grew up believing the world was essentially good, that hard work and kindness were currencies more valuable than gold, that if you treated people with respect and honesty, they would return the same. Her father told her stories every evening as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful to be real. And in those stories, heroes were always humble people who rose through virtue rather than cunning, who won not through force, but through the strength of their character. He would stroke her hair and tell her that her worth was not measured by what she had, but by who she was, that no amount of wealth could buy the kind of richness that came from a good heart, and she believed him absolutely because he had never given her reason to doubt. She learned to sew sitting beside her mother, threading needles by candlelight when the village generator stopped working, creating beauty from scraps of fabric that others had discarded, her stitches growing straighter and stronger with each passing year. She learned to cook by watching and helping, to tend gardens by working alongside her parents in the early morning coolness, to sing the old songs that connected her to ancestors she had never met, but whose blood ran through her veins like a river of memory. Life was simple and predictable and safe, a rhythm she thought would continue forever, the way children always believe their parents will never age and their homes will never change. Then everything shifted like sand beneath her feet when her mother fell ill, a sickness that came quietly at first, just tiredness that wouldn't lift, just a cough that wouldn't clear, just a weakness that spread through her body like shadows creeping across her rooms as the sun sets. The village healer came with herbs and prayers. The elders brought blessings, neighbors cooked meals and sat vigil. But some battles cannot be won through will alone. Some illnesses have a momentum that kindness cannot stop. Amara watched her mother fade day by day, watched the light in her eyes dim like a lamp running out of oil, held her hand, and sang the songs they used to sing together while her mother's voice grew too weak to join in. When the end came, it was both sudden and expected, a departure that left a hole in the world shaped exactly like the woman who had occupied that space, and Amara felt something inside herself crack that she wasn't sure would ever fully heal. Her father became a ghost after that, moving through days without purpose, eating without tasting, speaking without meaning, his grief so profound that it consumed him from the inside out. The village women tried to help, bringing food and comfort, sitting with him in the evenings. But grief is a journey that must be walked alone, and his path led him to a decision that would change Amara's life forever. Within 6 months of his wife's death, her father remarried, and the woman he brought home was nothing like the mother Amara had lost. Mrs. Okonkwo arrived like a storm, dressed in expensive fabrics and sharp perfume. A woman whose beauty was undeniable but cold, polished like glass, but just as hard. She came from the city, from a world of status and appearances, and she brought with her a daughter named Chidera, who had been raised to believe that life was a competition and only winners deserved respect. From the moment they crossed the threshold of the small house where Amara had grown up, everything began to change in ways both subtle and obvious, like watching a familiar landscape transform under gathering clouds. Amara's clothes were moved from the room she had shared with her mother to a tiny space barely bigger than a closet, her belongings pushed aside to make room for Chidera's endless array of outfits and shoes and accessories. Her chores multiplied overnight. Suddenly she was responsible for cooking every meal, washing every dish, sweeping every floor, while Chidera lounged in the shade, complaining about heat and boredom. At dinner, her father still smiled, still tried to create the warmth that had once filled their home. And Amara kept silent, because as long as he was happy, she could endure anything, could swallow her pride, and her hurt, and her growing understanding that she had become a stranger in her own house. Mrs. Okonkwo was careful at first, sweet to Amara's face while her father was present, but her true nature showed in small moments when he wasn't looking, in the way she criticized Amara's cooking with a smile, in the way she suggested Amara needed to work harder to earn her place, in the way she gradually shifted every burden onto Amara's shoulders while treating her own daughter like royalty. Then, Amara's father died, suddenly and without warning, his heart simply stopping one morning, as if it had decided it could not bear another day of missing the woman it had loved. Amara found him sitting in his chair by the window, where he liked to watch the sunrise, peaceful and still, and for a moment she thought he was sleeping, until she touched his hand and felt the coldness that no sleep could explain. The village came together for the burial, as they always did, singing songs and telling stories about the good man who had worked the land with honor. And Amara stood at the graveside, feeling like she was watching her own life, being lowered into the ground, alongside her father's body. She was 17 years old, and completely alone, orphaned in every way that mattered, standing beside a stepmother who dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief while calculating her next move. The morning after the burial, Mrs. Okonkwo's mask came off completely, revealing the cruelty that had been hiding beneath polite pretense, and she sat Amara down at the kitchen table with the cold efficiency of someone conducting a business transaction. She told Amara that things would be different now, that there was no money for freeloaders, that if Amara wanted to continue living in what was now officially Mrs. Okonkwo's house, she would earn her keep through work. The words were delivered without anger, without emotion, just facts being stated, and somehow that made them more devastating than any shouting could have been. So Amara worked, and she worked, and she worked some more, her days beginning before sunrise and ending long after dark. Her hands always busy with cooking or cleaning or sewing, her body always moving from task to task, while Mrs. Okonkwo and Chidera lounged and complained and demanded. She cooked elaborate meals and ate the leftovers standing at the sink. She scrubbed floors until they shined, and then watched Chidera walk across them with muddy shoes, without a second thought. She sewed dress after dress for Chidera to wear to parties and social events where wealthy young men gathered, spending hours creating beauty she would never wear, crafting elegance she would never experience. Mrs. Okonkwo had ambitions for her daughter, plans that involved marrying into wealth and status, climbing social ladders that required the right clothes and the right connections and the right opportunities. Chidera was pretty enough, with smooth skin and a figure that turned heads, but she had the personality of someone who had been told she was special. So many times, she believed the world owed her admiration. And that kind of entitlement showed in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, in the way she treated anyone she considered beneath her station. Amara became invisible in her own home, a shadow that cooked and cleaned and sewed, someone whose presence was only noticed when something wasn't done to Mrs. Okonkwo's exacting standards. But at night, when the house finally fell silent and she lay on her thin mattress in the tiny room, Amara would dream of a different life, of a place where kindness mattered more than status, where her worth was recognized, where someone might see her not as a servant, but as a person deserving of love and respect. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a courier in a crisp uniform who seemed almost apologetic about bringing such elegance to their modest neighborhood. Chidera snatched it from his hands before he could even complete his greeting, her eyes widening as she recognized the embossed seal on the thick ivory envelope, and she ran into the house, shrieking for her mother, with a pitch that suggested she had just won a lottery. Mrs. Okonkwo emerged from her afternoon nap, irritated at being disturbed, until she saw what her daughter was holding, and then her entire demeanor transformed, her body straightening, her eyes sharpening, her mind already spinning with possibilities. The invitation was to the Adebayo Foundation Gala, an annual event that brought together the wealthiest and most influential people in the country, a night where deals were made and alliances were formed and social positions were solidified or shattered. To receive an invitation meant you had status, meant you mattered, meant you moved in circles most people only read about in magazines. Mrs. Okonkwo had been angling for an invitation for years, attending smaller events, making connections, donating to causes, all in service of getting her daughter into rooms where billionaires and their sons might be found. And now, the invitation had arrived, and Chidera's name was printed on it in elegant script, and Mrs. Okonkwo could practically taste the victory she had been pursuing since the day she married Amara's father and gained a foothold in respectable society. The Adebayo family was legendary in ways that transcended mere wealth, their name spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty or religious figures, their influence touching every sector from technology to real estate to entertainment and philanthropy. They had built an empire that spanned generations, had survived colonial rule and independence, and every political shift that followed, had grown richer and more powerful with each passing decade, while maintaining a reputation for integrity and vision that made them beloved rather than merely feared. And at the center of it all was Kene Adebayo, the eldest son, the heir to everything, a man who had taken his family's fortune and multiplied it through intelligence and strategic thinking that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. He was 32 years old and had never been married, had never even been seen publicly with a woman, despite the fact that models and socialites and daughters of other wealthy families threw themselves at him with the desperation of people who understood that marrying him would mean never wanting for anything ever again. Rumors swirled about why he remained single. Some said he was secretly gay. Others claimed he was married to his work. Still others whispered that he had loved someone once and lost her and refused to settle for anything less than what he had known. But nobody knew the truth except Kene himself, and he kept his reasons locked behind eyes that revealed nothing and a smile that charmed everyone while trusting no one. Mrs. Okonkwo spent the next 3 weeks in a frenzy of preparation, hiring stylists and makeup artists and photographers, buying Chidera 7 different gowns before settling on one that cost more than most people's yearly salary, a shimmering gold creation that clung to every curve and practically announced its wearer's availability to the highest bidder. She coached Chidera endlessly on how to stand, how to smile, how to laugh at jokes even if they weren't funny, how to appear interested without seeming desperate, how to make eye contact without staring, how to be memorable without being inappropriate. Every detail mattered, every moment would count, because this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The chance to put Chidera in front of Kene Adebayo and pray that something sparked between them, that he would see her daughter and recognize what Mrs. Okonkwo had always known, that Chidera deserved a life of luxury and power. But then Mrs. Okonkwo had a thought, a cruel and calculated idea that made her smile in a way that never reached her eyes, and she turned to Amara one evening as the girl was washing dishes and told her that she would be attending the gala as well. Amara looked up in surprise, soap suds dripping from her hands, unable to believe what she was hearing, because she had never been invited to anything, had never been included in any of the social events that Mrs. Okonkwo orchestrated for Chidera. But her stepmother's smile made it clear this was not an act of kindness. Mrs. Okonkwo explained with false sweetness that it would look bad to leave Amara at home, that people might talk, that appearances mattered. But her real reason became obvious as she outlined Amara's role for the evening. Amara would carry Chidera's things, would fix her makeup if it smudged, would be available to fetch drinks, or make adjustments, or handle any small crisis that might arise, essentially serving as an unpaid assistant, while Chidera hunted for a husband among the wealthy guests. She would need to look presentable, Mrs. Okonkwo added, not like a servant, but not so nice that she would draw attention away from Chidera, a delicate balance that would require careful management. And then she handed Amara a small pile of fabric scraps, leftovers from Chidera's many dresses, and told her to make herself something appropriate, as if creating a gown suitable for a billionaire's gala from remnants and cast-offs was a simple task anyone could accomplish. But Amara took the fabric without complaint, without argument, without allowing the humiliation to show on her face, because she had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse, that survival sometimes meant swallowing your pride and doing what needed to be done. So she spent her nights sewing, her fingers moving by candlelight after everyone else had gone to bed, creating something beautiful from scraps that others had discarded, stitching together a cream-colored gown with delicate details along the shoulders that took hours of patient work to complete. It was not designer, not expensive, not the kind of dress that would make anyone stop and stare, but it was hers, created by her own hands, and there was dignity in that, even if no one else would recognize it. The night of the gala arrived with all the weight of destiny, though Amara didn't know that yet, didn't understand that fate had been slowly weaving threads that would finally come together in ways she could never have imagined. They traveled to the city in Mrs. Okonkwo's car, Chidera spending the entire journey checking her makeup in a compact mirror and adjusting her dress, while her mother offered last-minute advice in a voice tight with ambition and fear. Amara sat in the back seat, in her handmade gown, watching the landscape change from rural simplicity to urban complexity, feeling like she was traveling not just through space, but into an entirely different world, where she did not belong and never would. The hotel where the gala was being held looked like a palace, all glass and gold and architectural ambition, its entrance flanked by luxury cars that probably cost more than her father had earned in his entire lifetime. Doormen in pristine uniforms opened car doors, photographers lined the red carpet, and beautiful people glided past in designer everything, their confidence as expensive as their jewelry. Chidera emerged from the car, like a contestant in a beauty pageant, posing for cameras that weren't actually pointed at her, while Mrs. Okonkwo held her head high and pretended she belonged among these people who had been wealthy for generations rather than just pretending to be. And Amara followed 3 steps behind, carrying a purse and a shawl, invisible to everyone except the security guard who checked her invitation with slightly raised eyebrows, as if surprised that someone so obviously out of place had been permitted entry. Inside the ballroom, Amara felt like she had stepped into a dream or possibly a nightmare. She couldn't quite decide which. The space was enormous, with ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky, and every surface sparkled with light from crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls. The floor was polished marble that reflected everything, creating a dizzying effect of doubled reality, and the walls were draped in fabric that shimmered gold and cream and caught the light in ways that made the entire rooms seem to breathe with warmth. Tables were set with more silverware than Amara knew existed, each place setting a work of art in itself, and flowers were arranged in towering centerpieces that probably cost more than everything she owned. The guests moved through this space with the ease of people who had been born to wealth, women in gowns that cost thousands, men in suits tailored to perfection, everyone holding champagne glasses and having conversations that seemed to matter, despite the fact that Amara couldn't imagine what people who had everything could possibly need to discuss. Chideras immediately began working the room, her training kicking in, as she positioned herself near groups of young men, laughing too loud at things that weren't particularly funny, touching arms and shoulders in ways designed to seem casual, but were actually calculated. Mrs. Okonkwo hovered nearby, watching her daughter's performance like a director overseeing a play, occasionally stepping in to introduce Chidera to someone or steer her toward a particularly promising target. And Amara stood against a wall near the entrance, holding a glass of water someone had handed her, watching this world she didn't understand, feeling like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture whose rules and rituals made no sense to her, but clearly mattered deeply to everyone involved. That was when she felt it, a weight on her skin like sunlight, a presence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, even though she didn't understand why. She turned slowly, scanning the crowd for whatever had triggered this sudden awareness, and her eyes found him standing across the room near the bar, and the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. He was tall and elegant, his skin the color of mahogany polished to a deep glow, wearing a suit that fit him like it had been designed specifically for his body, and he was looking directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. This was Kene Adebayo. She knew it instinctively, even though she had never seen him before, knew it from the way people gave him space without meaning to, from the way conversations paused when he moved past, from the power that radiated from him like heat from a fire. But he wasn't looking at Chidera in her expensive gold gown. He wasn't looking at the models and socialites who kept glancing his way with barely disguised hunger. He was looking at Amara, at the girl in the handmade dress standing against the wall, holding water she hadn't asked for. And his expression was unreadable, except for something in his eyes that looked almost like recognition, as if he knew her somehow, as if he had been looking for her and had finally, impossibly, found what he had been searching for. Their gazes locked across the crowded room, and everything else faded into background noise, the conversations and music and clinking glasses becoming distant and unimportant. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, seconds feeling like hours, while hours compressed into heartbeats. And Amara couldn't look away from those dark eyes that held hers with such intensity. She felt like he was reading her soul. She saw him set down his drink, saw him start moving toward her with purpose, cutting through the crowd that parted instinctively before him. And panic rose in her chest because she didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why. This man, whose name was spoken with reverence, was walking directly toward her, as if she was the only person in the room. But before he could reach her, Mrs. Okonkwo noticed, her head swiveling around, as she followed other people's gazes, and realized with horror that Kene Adebayo was approaching her stepdaughter rather than her daughter, that somehow the invisible servant girl was about to ruin everything. She moved with the speed of desperation, grabbing Amara's arm with fingers that dug in hard enough to bruise, yanking her toward the grand staircase and away from Keen's path, hissing under her breath about knowing her place and not embarrassing the family. Amara tried to explain that she hadn't done anything, hadn't encouraged anything, but Mrs. Okonkwo wasn't listening, was only focused on damage control and preventing whatever disaster she imagined was about to unfold. They reached the staircase, Mrs. Okonkwo positioning herself above Amara so she could look down with all the superiority she felt. And that was when her fingers found the shoulder of Amara's handmade gown and pulled, the fabric tearing with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in Amara's ears. The delicate stitching she had spent hours creating, coming apart in seconds beneath her stepmother's deliberately cruel hands. The dress ripped clean down the side, exposing the simple slip Amara wore beneath, and for a moment she just stood there frozen, her hands moving automatically to hold the torn fabric together, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Mrs. Okonkwo's voice rang out with false concern, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, explaining that she had only been trying to adjust the dress, but some things just fall apart when they're not properly made, when they're not meant to be. The implication clear that Amara herself was the thing that didn't belong. Laughter followed, not cruel perhaps, but careless, the kind of amusement people feel when watching someone else's minor disaster, when witnessing a moment of social awkwardness that confirms their own superiority by comparison. Eyes turned toward Amara like searchlights, conversations paused, whispers began, and she felt her face grow hot with humiliation, even as she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had learned long ago not to cry in front of people who enjoyed her pain, had mastered the art of maintaining dignity even when everything inside her wanted to crumble. And she used that skill now, standing straight despite the torn dress, keeping her chin up, despite the whispers, refusing to give Mrs. Okonkwo the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, something was screaming. Some part of her that had endured years of cruelty and diminishment and invisibility was finally reaching its limit, was beginning to understand that survival was not the same as living, that sometimes you had to stand up even when standing up meant risking everything you had left. Then that voice cut through the noise again, the same voice that had commanded attention earlier, deep and certain and completely uncompromising, speaking a single word that made the entire ballroom fall silent, as if someone had turned off the sound. Enough. The word carried weight beyond its simple syllables, carried authority that came not from anger, but from absolute certainty, from the kind of power that didn't need to be proven, because everyone's already knew it existed. Kene Adebayo appeared beside Amara, as if he had materialized from nowhere, though of course he had simply walked up the stairs, and without asking, without hesitating, without seeming to care that 100 pairs of eyes were watching, he removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket was warm from his body heat, smelled like expensive cologne, and something else, something clean and masculine, that made Amara's head spin slightly as she pulled it tighter around herself. It covered her torn dress completely, hung on her smaller frame, like a protective shield, and the gesture was so unexpected, so impossible, that for a moment Amara thought she might be dreaming, might have fallen asleep, standing up, and imagined this entire scenario. But the jacket was real. His presence beside her was real. And when she finally gathered the courage to look up at his face, she found him staring at Mrs. Okonkwo with an expression that made the older woman take an involuntary step backward. His face was calm, not angry in the way people expected anger to look, but there was something in his eyes that promised consequences, that communicated danger without needing to raise his voice or make threats that sounded like threats. Kene spoke directly to Mrs. Okonkwo, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, telling her that if she ever touched Amara again, she would learn what it meant to lose everything. And somehow the quiet statement was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. Mrs. Okonkwo's carefully constructed mask of confidence cracked visibly, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words that wouldn't come, her mind racing to understand how this had happened, how her plan had gone so spectacularly wrong, how the servant girl she had been tormenting was suddenly being defended by the most powerful man in the room. Chidera stood beside her mother in her expensive gold gown, her face twisted with disbelief and jealousy, unable to comprehend why Kene Adebayo was looking at Amara like she mattered, like she was someone worth protecting, like she was more important than all the beautiful women in designer dresses who had been vying for his attention all evening. The crowd watched in fascinated silence, phones already coming out to capture this moment, social media posts already being composed in people's heads, because this was the kind of drama that would be discussed for months, the kind of story that would spread through elite circles like wildfire, adding to the legend of Kene Adebayo, who had just publicly humiliated a woman for mistreating what appeared to be her own family member. But Kene wasn't performing for the crowd, wasn't playing to an audience. His attention was entirely focused on Amara, and when he finally turned away from Mrs. Okonkwo, his expression softened into something that looked almost like tenderness, almost like hope, almost like he was seeing something precious he thought he had lost forever. He asked Amara to come with him, his voice gentle now, so different from the cold authority he had used with her stepmother, and though every instinct told her to run, to hide, to make herself small and invisible, the way she always had, something deeper made her nod. She placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close around hers, with surprising gentleness, for hands that clearly held so much power, and together they walked through the crowd that parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Whispers erupted in their wake, speculation and shock and curiosity mixing into a sound like wind through leaves. But Amara barely heard it, because her entire awareness had narrowed to the feeling of Kene's hand holding hers, steady and warm, and somehow familiar, despite the fact that they had never touched before. He led her through a side door, onto a private terrace that overlooked the city, the night air cool against her heated skin. The stars above, scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. Below them, the city spread out in a carpet of lights, millions of people living their lives, each one a universe unto themselves. And up here on this terrace, it felt like they were the only two people in the world, suspended between earth and sky, in a moment that existed outside of normal time. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, just stood there breathing and being. And Amara found herself studying his profile in the dim light, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to make sense of why this man had stepped in to defend her, why he was looking at her like she was someone he knew, someone he had been searching for. Finally, Keen turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, but couldn't, and he asked if she remembered him. Amara frowned, confusion mixing with the adrenaline still coursing through her body, because she was certain they had never met before, certain she would remember encountering someone like him, someone whose presence was so overwhelming that forgetting him would be impossible. But he smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face from powerful and intimidating to almost boyish, almost vulnerable. And he told her about 5 years ago, about her village, about Umuna. The name hit her like a physical thing, pulling her back through time, to a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else, and she watched as Kene explained that he had been there with his father, investing in a school project, trying to locate the construction site, when he got separated from his team and found himself lost in the winding paths between compounds. Amara's breath caught as a memory surfaced, hazy at first but growing clearer, of a young man in casual clothes who had approached her near the market, asking for directions, his expensive watch and polished shoes marking him as someone from the city, but his smile friendly and genuine. She had walked him all the way to the site, nearly a mile out of her way, and they had talked the whole time about everything and nothing, about her dreams of seeing the world beyond the village, about his desire to build things that mattered, about the way the sunset looked over the hills, painting everything gold and red. She remembered now, the memory flooding back with sudden clarity, how he had listened to her talk about her life, with genuine interest, rather than the polite boredom most city people showed when villagers spoke. How he had asked questions about her dreams and actually waited for real answers. How he had looked at her like she was interesting, like her thoughts mattered, like she was someone worth knowing. At the time, she had assumed he was just being kind, just being polite, just passing time with conversation, while a stranger guided him through unfamiliar territory. And when they reached the construction site, and he thanked her, she had assumed that was the end of it, that he would return to his important city life and forget all about the village girl who had walked him through dirt paths and pointed out shortcuts through cassava fields. She never knew his name, never thought to ask, because he seemed like someone from another world entirely, someone she would never see again. And after her mother died, and her father remarried, and her life transformed into something unrecognizable, that afternoon had faded into the collection of memories she kept locked away, pleasant moments from a life that no longer existed. But Kene was telling her now that he had never forgotten, that he had searched for her, sent people back to the village to find the girl who had shown him kindness without knowing who he was, who had treated him like a person rather than a name or a bank account, who had talked about goodness and hope like they were real things that mattered in the world. His voice carried weight as he explained how the village elders told his people that her father had passed, that the family had scattered, that no one knew where she had gone, and how he had spent years wondering what happened to her, hoping she was safe, carrying the memory of that conversation like a torch in the darkness. Tears gathered in Amara's eyes as she listened to him speak, as the impossibility of this moment settled over her like a blanket woven from fate and chance, and something that felt almost like destiny. Here was a man who had built an empire, who commanded resources beyond imagination, who could have anything or anyone he wanted, and he was standing on this terrace, telling her that he had been searching for her, that their brief encounter 5 years ago had mattered to him, that she had mattered to him in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. He told her that when he walked into the ballroom tonight and saw her standing against the wall, he knew immediately, recognized her, despite the years and the changes, felt something click into place inside him, like a key turning in a lock. She tried to speak, tried to ask why, tried to understand how someone like her could have made such an impression on someone like him, but he reached out and gently touched her face, his fingers warm against her cheek, and told her that she had seen him, truly seen him, looked past everything else, and connected with the person beneath all the wealth and power and expectation. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, where every interaction carried calculations and agenda, she had simply been kind because kindness was who she was, had helped because helping was what you did, had talked to him like he was just another human being, deserving of respect and genuine connection. That, he said, was rarer than diamonds, more valuable than anything money could buy, and he had known even then that he would spend his life looking for that feeling again. Amara's voice finally found its way out, trembling and uncertain, asking him how he could want her when she had nothing, when she was nobody, when her own stepmother could tear her dress in public and humiliate her without consequence. But Kene's expression grew fierce, not angry but passionate, and he told her that she had everything that mattered, that she carried wealth inside her that Mrs. Okonkwo would never understand, that kindness and integrity and genuine goodness were currencies more valuable than all the money in the world because they couldn't be bought or faked or manufactured. He told her that he had met thousands of people in his life, beautiful people and brilliant people and powerful people, but he had never met anyone who made him feel the way she had made him feel that afternoon in the village, like the world was good, like there was hope, like building a better future was possible because people like her existed in it. She started to protest, to list all the reasons why this couldn't be real, why he would wake up tomorrow and realize he had made a mistake. But he stopped her words with a look of such certainty that arguments died in her throat. He asked her a simple question then, direct and clear and demanding truth. Did she feel it too? This connection, this recognition, this sense that they had found something rare and precious that most people searched for their entire lives without ever finding. And Amara, who had spent years making herself small, making herself invisible, denying her own needs and wants and feelings, found herself nodding, tears streaming down her face as she admitted yes, she felt it, had felt it, from the moment their eyes met across the ballroom. Maybe even from that afternoon 5 years ago, though. She hadn't understood it then. Before either of them could say more, the terrace door burst open, and Mrs. Okonkwo stormed through, with Chidera trailing behind like a shadow dressed in gold, both their faces twisted with emotions that ranged from disbelief to fury to desperate calculation. Mrs. Okonkwo started speaking immediately, her voice loud and sharp, apologizing to Kene for her stepdaughter's behavior, claiming Amara had a habit of causing scenes and seeking attention, weaving a story that painted her as the victim of a manipulative girl who had clearly orchestrated this entire situation to trap a wealthy man. Chidera added her voice to the assault, her words dripping with venom as she called Amara a servant and a nobody, someone who didn't belong in this world, someone who was embarrassing everyone with delusions of grandeur. But Kene's expression had gone cold again. The warmth he had shown Amara, replaced by the kind of authority that made even Mrs. Okonkwo's voice falter mid-sentence. He let them finish their performance, let them dig themselves deeper into the hole they were creating. And then he spoke with a calm that was somehow more devastating than anger could ever be. He told them that every year he hosted this gala, hoping Amara would attend, that he had invited families from every region, searched guest lists, waited patiently for fate to bring her back to him. Mrs. Okonkwo's face went pale as she processed his words, as she realized that the servant girl she had been tormenting was the reason the most powerful man in the country threw the most exclusive party of the year, and Chidera's expression crumbled into something ugly and desperate, as years of believing she was special collided with the reality that she was completely ordinary. Then Kene said the words that changed everything, speaking them clearly and deliberately, so there could be no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation, no room for doubt. He told them that Amara was the woman he intended to marry, that she was the one he had been searching for, that his wealth and status and power all meant nothing compared to finding her again. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the city below, and Chidera's sharp intake of breath that sounded almost like a sob. Mrs. Okonkwo tried to rally, tried to protest that this was absurd, that Amara had no family or name or breeding. But Kene cut her off, with words that landed like judges' verdicts, telling her that Amara had him, and that was more than enough for anyone. His voice dropped even lower as he told Mrs. Okonkwo that she would leave immediately, that she would never approach Amara again, that if he heard even a whisper of her causing problems, he would personally ensure that every door in the city closed to her. Every social connection she had cultivated would evaporate. Every pretense of respectability she had built would crumble to dust. It wasn't said with anger or malice, but with the certainty of someone stating facts, laying out consequences the way you might explain that fire burns or water flows downhill. Simple cause and effect that required no emotion to be devastating. Mrs. Okonkwo's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her mind clearly racing through scenarios and outcomes, calculating whether she could fight this or whether resistance would only make things worse. And whatever conclusion she reached made her grab Chidera's arm and pull her toward the door without another word, both of them fleeing like animals before a predator, their expensive clothes and careful makeup suddenly looking cheap and desperate in the face of real power wielded with precision. When the door closed behind them, silence settled over the terrace again. But this time it felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the air itself. Kene turned back to Amara, his expression softening immediately, the cold authority melting away to reveal the gentleness underneath, and he asked if she was okay, his concern so genuine that it made her want to cry all over again. She nodded, unable to speak, past the emotion clogging her throat, and he reached out to take her hand again, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. He told her he knew this was overwhelming, that he was moving fast, that he didn't expect her to say yes to marriage right now. But he needed her to know that his intentions were serious, that this wasn't some whim or impulse, but a truth he had been carrying for 5 years. He wanted to court her properly, he said, wanted to give her time to know him, wanted her to choose him freely, rather than feeling trapped by circumstance or obligation or the dramatic nature of their reunion. His words were careful and respectful, acknowledging the power imbalance between them while trying to minimize it, trying to create space for her to have agency in a situation where she held little practical power. And Amara, who had spent years being told she was nothing, who had learned to expect cruelty rather than kindness, found herself believing him, found herself trusting in a way she hadn't thought possible anymore. She told him yes, she wanted to know him, wanted to understand this connection they shared, wanted to see if the future he was suggesting could actually be real, rather than just another dream that would dissolve in daylight. The weeks that followed felt like living in a story someone else had written, events unfolding with a surreal quality that made Amara constantly check if she was dreaming. Kene was true to his word, courting her with patience and intentionality that took her breath away, showing up at the small apartment he had immediately arranged for her to move into, away from Mrs. Okonkwo's house, bringing flowers and conversation and genuine interest in her thoughts and dreams. He took her to his family estate, a sprawling property where gardens stretched toward horizons, and the main house looked like something from a magazine, and introduced her to his mother, a woman whose elegance was softened by warmth, and whose eyes lit up the moment she saw Amara. His mother told her that Kene had talked about her for years, about the village girl who had shown him kindness, who had made him believe in genuine goodness, and she took Amara's hands in hers and said she was grateful that her son had finally found what he had been searching for. Amara met Kene's siblings and extended family, people who could have looked down on her humble origins, but instead welcomed her with genuine warmth, asking about her life and her dreams, and treating her like she belonged among them. She learned that Kene's wealth had never been about acquisition or display, but about legacy and purpose, that he built schools and funded hospitals and created opportunities for people who had none, that his business decisions were guided by values rather than just profit. He showed her spreadsheets and plans for projects in rural areas, asked her opinion on how to make programs more effective, listened when she spoke about the needs she had witnessed growing up in the village, and she realized he wasn't just being polite, but genuinely valued her perspective because she had lived experiences he didn't have, understood communities he could only observe from outside. Meanwhile, Mrs. Okonkwo's carefully constructed world began to crumble exactly as Kene had promised it would, her social standing dissolving like sugar in rain as word spread about what she had done at the gala. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends became suddenly busy when she called. The ladies who had once courted her favor now avoided her in public spaces, their loyalty evaporating the moment association with her became socially costly. Chidera's engagement to a moderately wealthy businessman was quietly canceled after his family heard the story, unwilling to connect themselves to a woman who had shown such cruelty and a mother who had raised her that way. The house that Mrs. Okonkwo had taken over after Amara's father died suddenly became difficult to maintain without the social connections that had brought opportunities her way, and she found herself struggling financially in ways she had never imagined possible. The security she thought she had built revealed as nothing more than smoke and mirrors propped up by associations that vanished the moment real power turned against her. She tried to reach out to Amara once, a phone call where her voice carried tones that might have been regret or might have been manipulation, claiming she had made mistakes, but they were still family, trying to use guilt and obligation as weapons one final time. But Amara, who had grown stronger in the weeks surrounded by people who valued her, who had begun to understand her own worth through Kene's patient demonstration of it, found her voice and spoke truth clearly. She told Mrs. Okonkwo that family didn't tear you down, to lift themselves up, that love didn't require humiliation as payment, that she forgave her, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or allowing the cruelty to continue. She said these words calmly, without anger, simply stating facts and boundaries, and then she ended the call, cutting the final thread that had bound her to that painful chapter of her life. 6 months after the gala, Amara stood in her home village of Umuna, but this time she wasn't running from anything or surviving despite odds stacked against her. She was there by choice, with purpose, surrounded by young girls who looked at her with eyes full of hope and possibility, standing in the center of a brand new building that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The sewing school she had envisioned with Kene's support was real now, solid walls and working machines and shelves full of fabric and supplies, a place where girls could learn skills that would give them options, where they could build confidence and independence, where they could dream bigger than the limitations their circumstances had suggested. The building was modest, but beautiful, designed to honor traditional architecture while incorporating modern amenities, and through its windows, sunlight poured in patterns that made everything glow gold. She walked between the sewing stations, touching machines and meeting eyes, remembering when she had been one of these girls, sitting by candlelight with needle and thread, creating beauty from scraps, because that was all she had, dreaming of a different life, while hardly daring to believe it could be real. Now she was here to tell them that dreams mattered, that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances, that kindness and integrity and hard work could open doors they couldn't yet imagine. She taught them stitches her mother had taught her, shared stories about persistence and patience, but more than technique, she tried to give them something more valuable: the belief that they were enough, that they deserved respect and opportunity, that the world was bigger than the small corner they currently occupied. And watching from the doorway, Kene stood with his arms crossed and a smile on his face that spoke of pride and love and certainty that this was exactly where he was meant to be, supporting this woman who had captured his heart by simply being herself. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in those same shades of orange and purple that Amara remembered from childhood, Kene took her hand and led her to the old mango tree where her father used to tell stories. The tree was still there, still spreading its branches like protective arms, still offering shade and shelter to anyone who needed it, and beneath its canopy, Kene knelt before her, while the village watched from respectful distances, giving them space but present enough to witness this moment. He pulled out a small velvet box, opened it to reveal a ring that was simple and elegant, beautiful, without being ostentatious, clearly expensive, but chosen for meaning rather than display. He told her he had already asked once, at the gala, in the heat of emotion and revelation, but he wanted to ask again here, in the place where she had become the woman he loved, in the presence of the community that had shaped her, under the tree where her father had taught her about worth and dignity and kindness. His voice was steady as he spoke, asking if she would marry him, if she would build a life with him, if she would let him spend his days proving that she had always been enough, had always been valuable, had always been exactly who she was meant to be. Around them, the village had gone quiet, elders and children, and everyone in between, watching this moment that somehow felt like it belonged to all of them. Like Amara's story was their story too. Like her triumph over suffering and her recognition by someone who truly saw her was vindication for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. Amara looked at Kene's face, at the hope and love in his eyes, at the future he was offering that was built on respect and partnership rather than rescue or obligation. And she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, all the pain and loss and humiliation that had taught her who she was beneath circumstances. She thought about her father's words, spoken so many years ago, under this same tree, about worth being measured by who you are, rather than what you have. And she understood now what he had meant, understood that she had carried wealth inside her all along, even when the world tried to convince her she was poor. She thought about her mother's gentle strength, about the way she had loved without counting cost, about how she had created beauty and warmth from simple ingredients, and she felt that legacy living in her own hands, in the school she had just opened, in the girls she would teach and inspire. She thought about Mrs. Okonkwo and Chidera, about how their cruelty had almost convinced her that she deserved nothing, that she should be grateful for scraps, and she felt gratitude not for them, but for the fact that she had survived their treatment, without becoming like them, without letting their poison corrupt the goodness her parents had planted in her soul. And she thought about Kene, about this man who had searched for her across years and miles, who had recognized her in a crowded ballroom, who had defended her without hesitation, who had shown her that real love saw clearly and valued truly, who had been patient and respectful while she learned to trust again. She thought about all of this in the space of a heartbeat, and then she smiled, tears streaming down her face, but her voice clear and certain, as she said yes, yes, she would marry him. Yes, she would build a life with him. Yes, she believed in the future they could create together. The village erupted in cheers and ululation, the traditional sounds of celebration echoing across the fields, and Kene slipped the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home, like safety, like everything she had been searching for without knowing she was searching. The wedding took place 3 months later, a celebration that honored both worlds Amara now inhabited. Traditional ceremonies in the village, followed by an elegant reception in the city. Both events filled with people who loved them genuinely, rather than guests there for appearance or advantage. In the village, Amara wore traditional wraps in rich colors, her head adorned with beads and coral, her body moving through ceremonial dances that connected her to ancestors and community, and Kene participated in rituals that welcomed him into her family's lineage, despite the fact that her blood relatives were gone, the village claiming them both as their own. In the city, she wore white that flowed like water, elegant and simple, her natural beauty needing no enhancement, and they exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising partnership and respect, and the kind of love that sees clearly and chooses anyway. Among the guests were the girls from her sewing school, sitting in places of honor, watching their teacher become a bride, and understanding in their young hearts that transformation was possible, that circumstances didn't define destiny, that kindness and integrity could carry you to places you never imagined reaching. Mrs. Okonkwo was not invited and did not attend, her absence a relief rather than a wound, though Amara learned later that she had watched news coverage of the wedding from her increasingly modest home, seeing the life her stepdaughter had built, the happiness she had tried to crush but failed to destroy. Chidera had moved to another city, trying to rebuild her reputation, far from people who knew her story. And Amara felt neither satisfaction nor resentment about her stepsister's struggles, only a kind of neutral acknowledgement that people create their own futures through their choices, that cruelty eventually isolates, while kindness connects, that the seeds you plant inevitably grow into the garden you inhabit. Now, looking back from the distance of happiness and security, Amara understood that her story had never been about rescue, or fairy tale magic, or luck randomly distributed by an indifferent universe. It had been about holding on to her essential self through trials that tried to strip it away, about maintaining dignity when the world offered humiliation, about believing in goodness even when surrounded by cruelty, about recognizing love when it appeared even when it wore unexpected faces. Her father's lessons had been true all along. Worth came from character rather than circumstance. Wealth could be carried in your heart, even when your hands held nothing. Love given freely would eventually find its way back multiplied. Mrs. Okonkwo had taught her lessons too, though not the ones intended, showing her what happened when you built your life on appearances and cruelty, when you measured worth by wealth and treated people as tools for your own advancement. And Kene had taught her the most important lesson of all, that being truly seen, genuinely recognized for who you are, beneath surface and circumstance, was the greatest gift anyone could offer or receive. Their marriage thrived, not because he had rescued her from poverty, or because she had secured his wealth, but because they saw each other clearly and chose each other freely, because they built their life on respect and partnership, and the kind of love that celebrates rather than diminishes. The sewing school in Umuna expanded, opening branches in other villages, teaching hundreds of girls that their worth was inherent and their dreams were valid. Amara's story became legend in her community, told beneath mango trees to new generations, a modern folktale about a girl who survived cruelty without becoming cruel, who maintained kindness when the world offered reasons for bitterness, who was rewarded not by magic, but by the natural consequence of living with integrity. And the moral of the story, the lesson that echoed through years and lives it touched, was simple but profound. Love built on truth is the greatest treasure of all, because when you are seen for who you truly are and loved anyway, that is when you are truly wealthy. That is when you have everything that matters. That is when you understand that you were always enough and always will be. In the end, Amara learned what her father had tried to teach her from the beginning, that the greatest riches are carried in the heart, that dignity cannot be torn like fabric, that real love sees past surface to soul, and that sometimes the girl everyone underestimates is actually a queen who simply hasn't claimed her crown yet. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that goodness matters and kindness counts, and your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it, then share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. Because stories like this are meant to be passed along, meant to inspire, meant to remind us all that love and integrity and genuine human connection are the currencies that truly matter in this life, and those treasures are available to anyone brave enough to remain themselves no matter what the world tries to make them become.